I now call upon Professor Menon. He would be speaking to us on perspective of higher education, reference to the new education policy. Professor Menon, please.
Thank you. Mr. Srivastava, fellow panelists and listeners. Policies are usually made sense of in terms of their text, subtext, and context. In the case of the National Education Policy 2020, a serious engagement with the text is not very meaningful at this stage, in my opinion, since the strategy documents and a program of action that should ideally have accompanied the policy document are still awaited. Moreover, given that the policy was born in the middle of a major economic crisis, there is no clarity about how much financial resources that will be available in actuality to support implementation of the policy. Without a strategy, a roadmap, and clarity about how the necessary additional resources are going to be mobilized, the policy document is largely a vision and a list of intentions by the central government. What's more, NEP 2020 is not yet, in the real sense of the term, a national policy, because one doesn't quite know how well prepared the state governments are to implement this, battered as they are by the present pandemic crisis and the consequent contraction in the economy, not to mention the outstanding problems of revenue sharing under GST. After all, the states account for about 75 to 80% of the total public spending on education. In the light of all this, we think it's a little too premature for us to engage in detail with the specific provisions of the policy. It's a bit like debating on the future of an infant still struggling with acute neonatal trauma, a part of which stems out of congenital disorders that might turn out to be chronic. One must, however, hasten to add that the situation is nothing very unique about NEP 2020. The years that followed the promulgation of NPE in 1968 saw a major war, an unprecedented refugee crisis, inflation, and repeated devaluation of currency, resulting in large-scale diversion of funds away from education and thus leaving several proposals in the policy relegated to the margins or severely under-resourced. In the case of NP in 1986, its promulgation was followed by the fall of a majority government and an alternative education policy that the succeeding government tried to moot. By the time a program of action was eventually released in 1992, the context had already changed drastically because of the balance of payment crisis and the structural readjustments that the government had to bring about as a consequence. Keeping one pace ahead of its predecessors, the NEP 2020 is born into the vortex in the very epicenter of a crisis. What makes it more curious is that the birthing of NEP 2020 is not through natural delivery, but through a caesarean section. It is as though its birth is timed to be at the very moment when India is going through its worst economic crisis since independence. Now here the spotlight shifts to the context of the policy. You can't find fault with someone who would wonder whether the promulgation of NEP 2020 couldn't have waited till the pandemic crisis was over, when parliamentary and other legislative and consultative processes would get back to some kind of normalcy. That Commission report and deliberated at length by a committee of parliamentarians before it was debated and approved by the parliament. As for NP in 1986, it was an outcome of a perspective document called Challenge of Education, a policy perspective, that had been put through a process of wide consultation. The draft policy document was then debated by the parliament and eventually approved. Keeping with this precedence, couldn't the NEP 2020 also have been given its due legitimacy through the process of a proper parliamentary debate and approval, even if one might argue that it was not a statutory requirement? Given the majority support that the present government has in parliament, the approval of the policy would never have been at risk. However, through that exercise, the policy document would have gained a great deal in substance as well as in form, particularly its legitimacy and acceptability. Wouldn't that have given both the policy as well as the parliament their due dignity? Through our recent years' experience, we have gotten used to how great spectacles are periodically curated for the consumption of the citizens in what Shashi Tharoor terms as a shock and awe style. Were the chosen time and the manner of promulgation of NEP 2020 also specially curated, perhaps for managing headlines in the middle of other crises? What might be the larger political purpose that the NEP 2020 might be serving? Would this also be a component in the political strategy of a strong central government to make incursions into the domain of the states? These questions need thoughtful examination. I will not attempt it now because my brief for this afternoon is limited. That is to look at the policy from the perspective of higher education. I have several issues in my mind about public higher education, particularly about state universities and their colleges, where a large proportion of our students study. The under-resourced and anemic status of these institutions worries me no end. I would tend to think that the projected increase in the GER as per the policy from the present 26% to 50% by 2035 will impose immense additional burden on public systems. Unless adequately resourced, we will be continuing to let down millions of first-generation higher education seekers with the farce of granting access to higher education, but with no assurance of quality. Access without quality is no access at all. This is a critical issue, but I will not talk about it today. I would rather wait for the strategy documents and the program of action to be released for a more substantive discussion on this matter. So let me get back to the text. My focus is related to the policy document's listing of problems in higher education, its vision statement, and some issues around it. The section on higher education in NEP 2020 begins with a credo that, and I quote, "This policy envisions a complete overhaul and re-energizing of higher education system," unquote. The policy starts with listing the problems currently faced by India's higher education. The problems highlighted in this list include fragmentation, lack of focus on cognitive outcomes, disciplinary entrenchments, suboptimal governance and leadership, ineffective regulatory system, affiliating structure, and so on. Some of these, like disciplinary entrenchment or affiliating structure, may well be useful starting points for policy thinking, but some other items in the list, like suboptimal governance and leadership, is only a symptom. The pathology clearly is political and bureaucratic interference, which unfortunately the policy document fights shy of acknowledging. I find this listing of problems problematic in that it is highly judgmental. The policy document does not deem it necessary to offer any reasoning that went into this listing of problems. Since there is no reasoning, there is also no diagnosis of the underlying maladies. It is as though there is nothing to explore and understand about what has made it possible historically for some of the institutions of higher education in India to do fairly well, even amidst the general gloom. For example, Indian Institute of Science, the first generation IITs, JNU, Jadavpur, among the older universities, and among undergraduate colleges, St. Xavier's College in Bombay, half a dozen of Delhi University's undergraduate colleges, Presidency College in Calcutta. Some thoughtful reflection would have been useful on why several highly accomplished universities of the past have regressed over the years into mediocrity. For example, Bombay, Madras, Patna, Mysore, Baroda, Allahabad, Pune, to name just a few. It would also have been useful to reflect on the recent experiences of several new universities that had been established since the turn of the millennium and have not made much of a mark, while a small subset of them, like Ashoka University, Ambedkar University, Delhi, and Kriya University, seem to show promise. In 2008-2009, the Government of India established some 16 central universities with an identical legislative template. It would have been good to examine why most of them have not bloomed to the extent they promised in these past 12 years, while a couple of them do show promise. Such an analysis, while formulating this policy, would have made this list of problems not merely one of symptoms, but would have thrown some light on the underlying pathology. An analysis of this kind would have led the policy document to be informed by the realization that unplanned growth, deficit funding, bureaucratization, politicking among the academic community, and governmental and political interference in governance as well as in faculty hiring are among the reasons why some of the well-established older institutions have regressed to mediocrity. The policy document would have also been enriched by the possible inference that wherever institutions have done well in spite of all these odds, it may be at least partly because they have been left without much meddling and have been allowed to grow in their own pace and in directions they themselves considered most appropriate. In other words, they have been recognized as organic entities, each rooted in their own context and each constituted of an academic community who, as a collegial body, determines how best to respond to the social needs of where they are located. Also, funding is a vitally critical factor. If the IITs have done well, it has also been because the per capita public investment in these institutions has been multiple times higher in comparison to that in other public higher education institutions. The policy document's vision of higher education comes across through a text that is exceedingly wordy and somewhat repetitive, all of which does not add much to its comprehensibility. For instance, the term multidisciplinary comes up repeatedly in the document. There is also invocation of institutions of higher education in ancient India, like Takshashila, Nalanda, Vallabhi, and Vikramshila, and an eloquent testimony to Banabhatta's 7th century novel Kadambari to highlight the importance of holistic and multidisciplinary education. In spite of all this, one is still left wondering what the term multidisciplinary is all about. Some of our universities in contemporary times could well be practicing not merely holistic and multidisciplinary education, but also transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary courses and programs. But the policy document would not acknowledge any of them. It would much rather invoke an ancient past. The subtext here is that after a hiatus of more than 1,000 years, there would now be an effort through this policy to revive some of the values and practices of ancient India. The policy document paints not merely in broad strokes, but at times even in finer details, the broad landscape of higher education in India by 2040. By that time, if the policy has its way, Indian higher education ecosystem will be populated with higher education institutions comprising universities and colleges, public as well as private, all of which will be multidisciplinary and each populated by more than 3,000 students, at least one in or near every district. Universities will do research as well as postgraduate and undergraduate teaching, some research intensive and some others teaching intensive, while colleges will largely be teaching at the undergraduate level, a number of them having medium of instruction in local or Indian languages or bilingually. The colleges may manifest as constituent colleges organizationally, if not physically, clustered around universities or as standalone autonomous colleges. This vision is promising, although this projected landscape might resemble somewhat what obtains even now, except for the slated intention of gradually dismantling the affiliation structure and enabling each higher education institution to eventually become independent, self-governing institutions with considerable faculty and institutional autonomy. All this is very heartening, but the imagination in the design of the policy runs dry beyond this statement of vision. Since the policy document forfeits the opportunity of probing into the basic pathology that is eroding the system, as I mentioned earlier, its intended treatment is in terms of more of what administrators are used to and comfortable with, albeit with some differences. All that the document has come up with as a way to get to this ideal situation is by assembling an elaborate accreditation and regulatory system out of the debris of the existing ones. The strategy is essentially herding institutions through a series of exercises that demonstrate compliance to standard and uniform templates enforced and operated by a large number of private accreditors overseen by a new regulatory architecture at the national level. How is this new regulatory regime going to be different from what exists now, except for the replacement of an existing edifice of regulatory institutions by a new architecture of institutions? The policy document assures us that the regulatory system is going to be a light but tight affair. I shall wait for the strategy documents to offer operational model of this light but tight regime. The problem, as I see, is that much of the mediocrity in the system that the policy rightly identifies stems out of a culture of mistrust and control, the seeds of which are in the very DNA of our larger system, not confined to education. So unless there is going to be a larger administrative reform, I am somewhat skeptical about how the vision of higher education, the policy, is going to be realized in spirit and in substance. The policy's endorsement of liberal education, unfortunately, does not hold much credibility because of the general environment of fear that pervades all over this country, and particularly in our campuses. And that cannot support creativity and a free flow of ideas. I genuinely feel sad that we may have forfeited another opportunity to really overhaul the system through a shift to a new paradigm of trust, easing of control, decentralization, and distribution of power, multiple nodes of regulation, and a lateral flow of ideas. Instead, the NEP 2020 has turned out to be yet another exercise of imposing uniformity and standardization along a single axis of control and power, which is paradoxically given India's size, population diversity, and constitutional federalism. I hope better sense prevail while preparing strategies and programs of action. Thank you for your patience, and thank you, IIC, for this opportunity.
The next question is to Professor Menon. The question asker is a very important person, Dr. Ramesh Deka, who was Director of All India Institute of Medical Sciences. His question is, how to internationalize higher education in India?
This is not about the policy, surely. I think if it's about the policy, one should ask the people who wrote the policy.
No, it's not relating to policy. It is a general question.
The global excellence and globally accepted standards and so on is often understood. And it's not just about this policy, but for several years, maybe for some 10, 15 years in India, this discourse of what is of international standards and global standards, world standards, all this used to be said. And I really feel that a globally excellent institution has to be, first of all, locally relevant. So only when it has an organic rooting on firm rooting on a particular stratum and is responding to that stratum in an organic manner, then can it rise itself to the level of a globally excellent institution. So international standards is largely in that sense. I wouldn't be really, think in terms of just collaborations and, faculty exchanges and twinning programs and stuff like that alone. That doesn't really create much of an international standards. Neither will inviting world players, foreign universities to come and set up shops here. Is not going to help. I think we need to really work in terms of creating excellent faculty. And if institutions have to be developed, there has to be good faculty. And we have to think of a serious program of creating excellence in our prospective faculty, attracting young, bright people to come into academia. A lot of attitudinal, the whole environmental ethos has to change for that. At the moment, it's a very unhappy situation. I hope it doesn't last for long. But at least in public universities, it's an environment of feeling oppressed and fearful. And I don't think those are the places where good research will happen. And those are the places where innovation of ideas will happen. All this will happen only if there is a certain liberality in the way in which universities, the ecosystem of universities is located. And only then will we rise to the international standards. It's not just a Lego toy approach of creating standard templates in various parts of the country and with linkages with institutions abroad, and suddenly it becomes international. I don't think it happens like that.
Kailash, you can proceed to. Are you going to deliver your vote of thanks?
Sir, now we come to the end of the program. On behalf of India International Center, I would like to profusely thank Professor Anurag Bihar, Dr. Krishna Kumar, Professor Shyam Menon for sparing their time for this webinar. And as I had mentioned earlier, this webinar has really aroused a lot of interest, and the number of participants who have joined this webinar indicates that. And I'm sure today's deliberations are definitely going to be much more helpful in understanding this new policy. So with these words, I once again thank each one of you profusely on behalf of IISc, and I look forward for your more and more participation in IISc webinars and physical programs in future. And in the end, I also like to thank our President, Sri N. Vora, who was kind enough to spare his time for chairing this entire session. Thank you very much, sir. And I thank everybody who has joined this webinar through the virtual mode. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.